Hello, my name is Akim Haralman, and I'm here with Professor Heather MacRae of York University to talk about social equality and inequality in the European Union. Equality amongst the citizens is explicitly listed in the Treaty on European Union as a fundamental value of the European Union. How has the EU interpreted this value in its policy making, and what kinds of policies has it pursued to put it into practice?
I think that's a really good question because it kind of shows us that there's a difference in a way between the values that the EU is putting forward and what actually comes out at the policy level. So the EU is really keen to and emphatic about this fundamental value of equality, and it's been entrenched in the treaties 25 years or more if we go back to sort of specific ideas. But I think one of the key things to remember is that the EU looks at equality, not equity. Even though some of the more recent texts will talk about equity, the policies are still leading to equality. So the difference really is that equality is about access and having access to the same resources, whereas equity is about what actually comes out at the end as being equal opportunities and equal outcomes. So I think that this is sort of one of the narrow ways that the EU has tended to look at this fundamental value. In terms of how they then ground that into social policy, first of all, it is very much about social policy, and that has a couple of implications. Social policy at the EU level is still relatively weak, and it's still pretty much grounded in member state policy making and member state initiatives. So the EU can set this framework, and that's really what they're doing, is setting a framework for equality and for discussions of equality, but they're not able to go down really deep. I think the other thing is that it's not redistributive. So the welfare state at the EU level is still very much about regulation, and the member states then doing the heavy lifting, if you want to call it that. I think finally it's that the EU's policies around these sorts of questions tends to sit mostly at the nexus of social and labor policy, social policy and labor market policy. So they're very employment based, they're very grounded in a sort of a neoliberal perspective, and that's been a very narrow focus of the EU's understanding of this fundamental value.
Equality and inequality have multiple dimensions which influence one another. How has EU policymaking evolved over time to address these various dimensions?
For me, actually, the history of this policy making has been really, really interesting, and I think we have to go right back to the origins with the Treaty of Rome and Article 119, which entrenched the basic value or the basic right of equal pay for work of equal value. And I think you can think about the progression of equality policies along sort of two different axes. So the first is this move from women's policy, which in Article 119 was really about employment and about competition. And so what I find interesting is that the framers, the founders, the so-called founding fathers, and I think it's important to talk about the founding fathers, they did not anticipate this as a social policy move. This was about competition and ensuring that the states that had a lower paid female workforce were not going to be able to exploit that workforce in a way that would give them a competitive advantage over other states. So France in particular was concerned about this and really insisted that this article be included. But what ended up happening was, because this was originally framed as part of the competition policy section of the Treaty of Rome, it was very strongly worded. And having such a strongly worded economic policy that then was shifted, because they didn't have enough things basically in the social policy section, it gets shifted into the social policy section. It retains its very strong wording. So this created a strong legal ground for the activists a few years later to come back to and to use as a springboard or a platform to then continue to work towards more equal rights for women, which of course in the 1960s and 70s was a key issue. And so that's sort of the springboard, and it's really about women's rights. And that axis continues from women's rights to gender rights to sort of family-based rights, reconciliation, and eventually on to intersectionality as they slowly expand. At the same time, starting around the 1980s, we see this expansion in the scope of what it means to discriminate. So it's not just about men and women, but they started to look at other forms of discrimination. So anti-Semitism was sort of one of the springboards in the early 1980s that came out of some of the rises in the radical right that we saw in some member states in the early 80s. And that then progresses to look at not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Black racism, about gender, or about ethnicity, religion, etc. So we see these two different axes kind of progressing at the same time, where now we're hopefully at a point where they're starting to converge back together, and we're starting to think about intersectional, so the ways in which these different discriminations or forms of discrimination or challenges can come together and make it more difficult for somebody to access their rights.
While there has been considerable legislative activity of the EU on issues of equality, some observers have argued that the EU's achievements have remained quite limited. What do they criticize about the EU's approach to equality and its achievements?
Oh, I think there's a lot of different angles that we criticize it for, because on paper it looks so strong. And so on paper we really think that the EU looks like this almost utopia of gender and non-discrimination, gender rights and non-discrimination. But in practice, it's not panning out that way on the ground for individuals. So I think that that's like the first key critique. But then we have to wonder, why is that happening? So it's easy to say, well, the equality is not there. But what is it about the policy that's preventing it from being properly implemented or transposed? And I think first main critique is that it tends to focus on employment still. So this is really, like I said, the grounding is in employment and labor policy. So they still have this strong focus, and it makes sense because it's what the EU is most able to do and most able to legislate and regulate. So on the one hand, this legislation or these policies are only able to see individuals and their discrimination if it's happening in the labor market. But we all know that the labor market is only one very small aspect, especially of discrimination policy. There's so much more around housing, access to healthcare, education, just feeling safe on the streets, violence in the home, all of these sorts of things that the EU doesn't legislate in the same way. So I think that's one real criticism. But the other criticism is around the teeth, that the EU has no real teeth to enforce the legislation because it relies on the member states to do that. And so while they look great on paper, it's really difficult for someone to actually access those rights, even if they have clearly faced discrimination, even in the workplace. You can't necessarily easily pursue that legal avenue in order to have your rights then recognized.
What are the key barriers preventing the EU from being even more effective in implementing equality measures?
I think the key barrier is really the member states. And this is because the EU works on this framework idea that what they can do is set out sort of minimum guidelines. But social policy is one of those areas that is still largely dependent on the member states. The EU likes to set and needs to set these frameworks, but the member states are the ones that need to look at how that fits within their own existing legislation, existing cultural and social norms. But if we're relying on existing social and cultural norms, and at the same time trying to change those existing cultural and social norms, you're going to come to an impasse. And so particularly now with the rise in far-right and right-wing governments, many of whom will consciously set their own policies against the EU's policies. So questions of gender equality, of racial equality, LGBTQ rights, all of these things become a key point where the member states can distinguish themselves from the European Union and be seen as being very strong and digging their heels in and saying, no, we're not going to do what the EU tells us. We will do what's best for our people. But their definition of our people can be very, very narrow. So this becomes a big barrier for the EU, who can only set the framework and the guidelines, but can't actually insist that a national court or a national police force or anybody else actually follow through on those rights.
What are some of the key points of similarity and difference in the ways that Canada and the EU approach overcoming inequality?
I think one of the main similarities is really their starting point, their legislative starting point, that for both of these jurisdictions, we've been starting from the idea of legislating equality in some way. And a lot of that legislation has come actually from the international level, like CEDAW and some of these other conventions that have sort of brought attention to questions of discrimination, not only against women, but now in the wake of Black Lives Matter, has really changed the way that the institutions are trying to understand themselves relative to their populations. But the ways in which they've gone about it have been very, very different. And so for me, one of the key differences is that Canada's strategy around combating discrimination has been to look for data, has been to try to figure out exactly where are we seeing discrimination and in what forms. What's the pay, what's access, who feels that they've been discriminated against in the housing market, in violence, in whatever. And in the EU member states, at the member state level, it's actually illegal in a number of states to collect data based on race, ethnicity, or religion. So we don't have the data to say that somebody is in a lower paid job as a result of these forms of discrimination. So without that kind of data, moving forward becomes very difficult. So for me, I think that's really the main difference, is in that strategy or approach.
Thank you very much, Professor MacRae, for this interview.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.